Okay, everybody, welcome. My name is John Coonrod. I work for the Hunger Project. I coordinate the movement for community-led development, and I'm so pleased to be moderating today's event. I consider this subject to be the most important subject in the world, not just because we're in the middle of a food crisis, but that the people who are most accountable for feeding more than 3 billion of our fellow people on this planet are shamefully underinvested in. Asma Latif, who's here, who is the organizer of this event, and Liz, who is her co-conspirator and the SDG2 Advocacy Hub, have put this together and also have put together something you'll find on the table if you didn't get it already on the web. And it's this new consensus with small-scale food producers. And they consulted with food producers around the world to hear what they are asking for. And there's an 8-point call to action. I just had the pleasure of being in an event with the new president of IFAD. And I asked him I said, it says here their number one ask is a voice in policymaking. Now, we have not been able to fill this room with smallholder farmers, but we have brought you here as champions for small-scale food farmers around the world. And all of us share that commitment to listen, to learn, and to find ways to strengthen them. So most of the poor people in the world are small-scale food producers. Most of the hungry people in the world are small-scale food producers, and most of them are women. And so as a woman from Burkina Faso said to me in a meeting once here in the World Bank, the number one question for each of us is, what institutions does she need in order to thrive and be successful? And the truth is, she needs everything. You know, she is responsible for so many things, for raising her family, for growing the food, for marketing, for processing. The women of Africa have said to be the backbone of Africa. And so what we have found is that they need everything, and they need it in one place, so that not spending their whole day walking from the creche to the clinic to the grain mill. You know, I know my African colleagues had devised another piece of paper which is out there called the Epicenter Strategy, where communities actually create a whole campus of basic services in one location, serving 15,000 people and operating it on a self-reliant basis. So it's possible to solve these problems, to end hunger and poverty, but right now particularly we need to issue a clarion call to action to strengthen that ecosystems of institutions that she needs to have her farming be successful. So we're going to hear from a number of speakers. We're breaking this into 3 20-minute chunks. And and this colleague, what is your name? Irene. Irene is going to keep us to time so that we can get as much conversation as possible. So we'll do a first segment. We'll have a conversation amongst all of us, and then a second and a third. So hopefully that will all turn out. So I will start this session by introducing our first two panelists. Dr. Latte Lawson-Lartego is the Chief Innovation Officer and Lead Food System for Oxfam America. And Colin Christensen is the Global Policy Director for the One Acre Fund. You have probably heard of both of these organizations. And so we're going to start with them. And the first question is, How have these overlapping crises, what people call the 3 Cs, climate change, COVID, and the conflict that has led to so much inflation, so much disruption of the whole economy, driving up inflation. How have these overlapping crises affected smallholder farmers? Over to you, Latte. What have you heard?
Thank you. Thank you, John, and everyone for coming. I think we all know what's going on in the world, but I'm going to give just some very simple illustration here. And if I may, when we talk about small-scale farmers, I want to expand that definition as well and include pastoralists, right? We tend to forget about them. Include fisher folks, people who really produce food that we eat. And what I want to share quickly is my CEO just came back from Somalia. And as you may know, the Horn of Africa is really in desperate need, and Somalia is going to be declared as a famine country very soon. So she visited Somalia, and what people were telling her, especially grandfathers, right, grandparents, this is the first time they have seen this kind of droughts in their lifetime. So you can see 60 years. So the issue right now is really critical. And one story is she met with Sophia, who is a 38-year-old mother of 8, divorced. Her livelihood is livestock, as you know. And because of the drought situation in Somalia right now, is they lost 90% of their livestock. So 90%, as we know, livestock for pastoralists is their life saving. So they lost almost everything. And what's happening? She tried to stay so she can keep the 10%. But guess what? At night, because of the dead animals, hyenas are now coming to her village. So she's now forced to leave her place, 3 days trip to the IDP camp. So that's the sad story. That's what's happening right now on the ground. And this is not just Sophia in Somaliland, but is also the rest of the Horn of Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia. When you go to West Africa with the Sahel, in Burkina Faso alone, there is about 2 million people displaced, and most of them are farmers, right? So it's a really critical situation that we are seeing on the ground. Farmers are getting poorer, they are losing their livelihoods, mostly because of the confluence of crises that we have, conflicts. The situation in the Ukraine is not helping, actually, with the inflation, the rise in the cost of fertilizer. So it's really a daring situation. I think it's an urgent moment for the community to come together.
Yes. Colin, what are you and your colleagues seeing?
Yeah, I think, Latte, I'm glad you positioned us with the Horn, because I think that's where you're seeing the biggest crisis. I think, unfortunately, though, I think we're also just seeing stress across smallholder communities, even outside of acute famine crises. I think the first point to make about smallholder farming is it's difficult. Farming is hard. It's hard everywhere, right? So One Acre Fund, we work with about 1.5 million farmers, and we look to solve these key market constraints that try to make it a little less hard, right? And organizations like One Acre Fund do this. You resolve the financing constraints. So farmers living under $1 a day can actually purchase fertilizer and seed, or you distribute high quality seeds into very rural areas where they work, or you provide training to maximize the return on the investment. And I think, John, your point earlier that you have to do all of this at the same time, and if you're lucky, in a good year, if you do all of this, maybe a farmer can grow enough food to feed their family and earn a little bit of extra money. That's in a good year. And I think what we're finding now is even that modest goal is unachievable. So certainly you have the crisis zones that Latte talked about, but if you're just looking at the price of fertilizer alone, it's causing massive hunger problems across Africa, across any area where you have smallholder farmers. So as an example, DAP, which is the kind of key fertilizer that we sell, between 2016 and 2020, it cost us about $500 a metric ton, and was pretty consistently $500 a metric ton. If you look at the graph on what happened to that price in 2021, when the COVID supply shock hit, it went all the way up to $1,000 a metric ton. Then Russia invades Ukraine, it went up to $1,200 a metric ton. It's come down, but it's only come down to $1,000 a metric ton. So farmers now, these are farmers that are taking $70 loans from us, are basically stuck with the reality that they can't buy enough fertilizer. And that's what it's going to mean, is they just don't buy enough fertilizer. And what happens when they don't buy enough fertilizer? They don't grow enough food, and their kids go hungry. Their kids get stunted. And then they get stunted over a few years, and then their futures get stunted. And that's the problem we're living in now, is that because of these price rises, even outside of crisis zones, we're looking at probably a generational effect on these communities.
So, you know, you just mentioned nutrition and health. The two go together. What are you seeing in terms of health? Because I know a lot of the rural communities that I visited are nowhere near a clinic. You know, despite all the investment and push for universal health coverage, it hasn't happened for so many people. What are you seeing in terms of health in addition to nutrition at this time?
Yeah, it's the same situation. Going back to Somalia, we see in some of the affected community, right, we see 1 out of 3 children very severely malnourished and going to hospital. Actually, as you say, there is no hospital. So we see that. We see the same situation in also, you know, crisis country Afghanistan. We did a quick survey during the COVID time last year across many countries, Rwanda, Kenya, even Vietnam, Zambia, the number of countries. What we see as well is the reduction in food consumption. Almost 80% of people that we spoke to have to reduce their meal. So health is impacted, actually, as we know. Food is health. Good food is health, actually. So those are the type of situation we see on the ground.
Yeah, I think maybe just a point to make here is, so we don't work with health systems, but one of the things we certainly try to do is help farmers, you know, grow more nutritious crops and, you know, have access to more nutritious, you know, food that they can grow themselves. But I think one of the challenges we're facing, and I think this is really being exacerbated through climate change, it's very difficult for farmers to pay for those more nutritious crops, right? Because what farmers need now, what their kids need today, is calories. They want their kids to have full bellies. So they want food that maybe is lower in nutrition but higher in caloric content, like maize, right? And I think one of the big challenges I think we face as a global community is, how are you helping farmers to transition to more nutritious crops so that they, you know, don't have to go to health centers? But it's hard because, as an example, we ran an egg pilot in Rwanda several years ago, and farmers sold the eggs instead of giving them to their kids, which is total rational sense, because eggs are very expensive, and if you sell one egg, you can translate that into, you know, more of a staple crop, right, to fill bellies. So the question, I think, with a lot of interventions around health is, you know, how are we going to help farmers pay for that? We know from our work that farmers will pay for fertilizer for seed. We work like a business, right? If they, you know, they are willing to pay for things that will give that immediate return. But I think when it comes to some of these health interventions, especially in the context of a changing climate, which is going to make them more important, I think that's where interesting conversations around kind of the responsibility of the rest of the world that's often created this crisis comes in to help farmers to pay for that.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll get to that, the upper echelons of the ecosystem for small-scale food producers. But, I mean, both of you work in situations where the key actors, the first responders, are the people in the communities, and often the women in the communities. And what have you seen that has worked in terms of local responses to by the people that you partner with?
Yeah, I mean, although, you know, the issue we are facing is really urgent, there's always a spotlight, of course. And we are seeing some of those, right? For instance, in one of our programs, we work a lot on seed issues. And as we know, seed is also getting very, business-driven, corporate, and seed that people used to grow themselves, right, are really getting away. So our initiative is really promoting how farmers, because of their own knowledge, they can grow their own seeds. And so we see this kind of adoption of seeds by farmers and the replication of seeds. And because of that, they are able to grow their own food, actually. And in Guatemala, for instance, during COVID, many of those farmers were able to grow, to have their own backyard garden, grow their own food. So when you see the impact on COVID on the population, I think those farmers who are able to really grow their own seed fare better. We just came back from the Philippines, where we are working on more and more urban food system, because the urban piece of food system tend to be forgotten. We always look at the rural areas, but obviously when you see the population trends, the projection is that by 2050, 70% of the world is going to live in urban areas. So how do we feed that population? So we are anticipating that, working on urban issues. And what we see in the Philippines as well is how women are becoming really enthusiastic and going around looking at land. We have big diaspora of the Filipinos living overseas, and using those land to turn that land into a productive land, and using garden and growing fruits, and also developing their own seed system, actually. So we see some bright spots that hopefully we can all learn from and adapt elsewhere. So there are some good things going on that we see.
Colin?
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, I think all of those good examples fit under this idea, this principle that farmers have agency, right? We just need to empower them. And what I love about the smallholder consensus is it's really about empowering farmers, right? It's not about handouts. It's about making sure they have the services, the access to inputs that they need. And I think those are all great examples. I want to maybe very quickly leave this image that I have in my head from a trip I was just in Western Kenya on, where I ran into one of the farmers that we work with that had this massive sack of tree seedlings, like 300 tree seedlings. And what he had done is, we have created these tree nurseries across Western Kenya because, it's a huge part of our program is agroforestry. And, this farmer had gone to one of those nurseries. He had picked up whatever it was, like 150 tree seedlings that we give out to any farmer that comes. And then he had bought another 150 on his own, right? Now, for 5 cents a seedling, it was affordable for him. But he spent his own money on that for him and his neighboring farmers, right? Yep. All he needed was to know that there was access to high-quality seedlings, to avocado, to grevilleas, to these indigenous species that we provide. And he went and got them himself and paid for more. And I think just as a general principle, if you just give access to services, farmers are willing to engage. Yep.
I've seen, particularly growing seeds, it can be very, very profitable. I know that some environmental refugees in Rajasthan, mostly women, worked with people from the M.S. Swaminathan Research Foundation to come up with seeds that they could produce that were very, very successful in that harsh environment. And it was very profitable for them. Women who had very little land could produce a lot of seeds. So I think looking at investing in steps that strengthen local food systems, because local food systems are going to be less prone to value chain disruptions and things like that. What else do you see can strengthen livelihoods? One of the things I learned from Dr. Swaminathan is that nobody really gets out of poverty just by farming. They need at least 3 income streams to get themselves out of poverty. And so even during this crisis, what kinds of livelihood opportunities have you seen for small-scale food producers?
Yeah, I think we really need to think about a small-scale farming system, right? And I mean, one idea would be how do we support that agency that you mentioned to really help people who really want to be farmer to be farmer, right? And do it in a very professional manner, right? Farming as business, things like that, and just enabling that to happen. So, and why not? Why don't we, include farmers in the farmer economy, for instance? Why farmers always have to be forgotten about, right? Left over. They are not in any kind of social security system, right? How can we think differently? So we can, we have some good example coming up. Some countries are doing some good work. How do we really identify farmers, include them, set some kind of standard? You are a farmer, you are declared as farmers, and you have savings that go into your retirement, for instance. Why can't we think differently? How can governments, look into that? Institutional, the World Bank, etc. So I think we really have to rethink the smallholder farmer and hopefully make it a profession. People who do that for a living. So that's one. The second thing we are working on is obviously government budget and multilateral budgets. Because given the current crisis, our fear is budget will be taken away from food to other sectors. Obviously, we were talking about energy in Europe. So we have been working hard. Like even in Africa, you have this kind of CAADP commitment where many governments committed to spend 10% on agricultural food. We don't see that. So still working with governments in many of those countries to really protect the investment in foods. Those are a few things that we see.
Good. Okay, so I want to open it for questions, comments, queries from all of us here. As we said, we really appreciate your being here, and you're all people who are probably directly involved with this. Liz, who actually has had a career in food, will bring you a microphone if you have a question or comment. So we'd like to hear from you.
Thank you very much for all the valuable input. This is Dalila. I'm a graduate student at University of Minnesota, and farming and agriculture are a big focus of mine. And farming is usually a very risky business, especially for small farmers, and especially in a climate crisis world that we're in. So on accessibility point, I want to ask what kind of technological advancement are you giving or supporting farmers so they can first adapt to climate action change, and second, to help them forecast climate changes to come. So, thank you.
Great question. Who wants to answer?
Yeah, I think technology isn't a silver bullet, is I guess my not so exciting response, right? I think technology has a role, but I think I would argue that what's much more important than technology is high quality service delivery, right? And a lot of times that's like not sexy stuff. It's just well-run organizations that can deliver the financing, the inputs, whatever. And I think that in some sense what's lacking most in a lot of these communities is just well-run service delivery. So I do want to make that point because I think that's where you win most of the battle. And just as a side note, I'm a big believer in social enterprises. I think we need less of this binary between like for-profit business models and like NGOs. I think you can leverage hybrid financing, including philanthropic money as well as revenue. This is what One Acre Fund does to make sure you create at scale good infrastructure to deliver that service. I know that wasn't your question, though. But it is important because once you've built that infrastructure and you've built that trust with farmers, you should definitely layer on technology. But I think the first key gap there is just digital literacy, right? In most of the places we work, farmers are still using very simple, dumb phones, right? They're not using smartphones, right? They don't have access often to even electricity to charge technology. So I think you need to come sort of to where they're at with technology to make it work for them. So we certainly do things at One Acre Fund like, layering on soil moisture estimates into SMS messages that we can send farmers to help nudge them to plant at the exact optimal time. So that can be used, and it's important. But I think what often happens with technology is people don't build the infrastructure first. They just come in with a tech. Farmers don't know you. They don't know how to engage with it. And as soon as your grant funding is gone, the technology will stop being used. So that's why I made the point that you have to start with the infrastructure first. And you need a business model that lets you build that infrastructure thinking about generations, not just 5 years.
Good point. Latte?
Yeah, just to add a quick plug here, we published this open access book. We call it Socio-Technical Innovation Bundles. The bundles is really, it's difficult to have one size fit all, right? You can have one technological solution here, but you need a bundle. You need to look at the sociology, the technology, even the political economy. You have to take all those things into consideration, as my colleague just said. So if it's open access, so you may want to take a look on it is online. So thank you.
Yes, sir. Yep.
Yes, thank you so much. My name is Julius Mkunda from Uganda, from the Civil Society Budget Advocacy Group. A question for Atiego. I mean, with all these problems, famine, hunger, drought, what is preventing governments from getting prepared? Because it happens every year, from getting prepared to deal with these issues, not in emergency, but making it a development issue. And for Colin is, there has been an argument that if you can guarantee markets for agricultural produce, that actually farmers can do it all themselves, extension services, seeds, and the rest. Is that an idea you share? I thank you.
Good point. Latte, Colin?
Yeah, that's a good question. What's preventing government? I think some of those issues, for me, with everything going on right now, government, especially government in Africa, should really seize this as opportunity, right? How do we, look at some countries in Africa depending on Ukraine and Russia for the wheat? Why so? I think we have land in Africa, right? We have good weather. We have crisis. So I think it's really an opportunity to seize, and also consumers have a role to play here. Like, why do you want to eat your bread that is colonial bread, right? I'm sorry to say. We have to change our mindset.
Decolonize bread.
Yes. I was born in Togo. We love French bread. Yeah. We love the fries from France, Milk is from Netherlands. Why so? So I think we have the resources. It's a political will, at least for me. We need government to step up, and is a public and private, and maybe civil society partnerships. These issues can be resolved if we have the political will to prepare. And more, even during COVID time, we saw some governments really. I was pleased to see some of them to use big data, digital, to be able to spotlight people and transfer money to them so that they can prepare. So the solutions are there. It's mostly political will. It's mostly civil society stepping up. It's also good governance. It's a lot of those things, but it's doable, I believe.
So firstly, thank you for not asking me the government question. It was much better that Latte could answer that. I think on the value chain question, it's tough. Like I said earlier, farming is hard, right? And making money off of higher value crops in any country is difficult, right? Commodity prices fluctuate. Coffee is great one year, the next year it's not. So I think that clearly helping small farmers diversify to higher value crops needs to be part of long-term work for economic development. Great. I think we all accept that. I think actually most development dollars go to that goal. Far fewer development dollars year by year are going to just helping farmers grow food to eat, right? It's in some sense, I think we often forget that most farmers, if you have half an acre of land in Burundi, right? It's going to be really, really hard for you to make money off of that half acre, right? Maybe you do a little bit of coffee, great, right? But it's mainly you're growing food to eat. And so I think we have to make sure we do both at the same time, and we don't push farmers beyond the food security goal too fast, because what will happen is they just won't grow the cash crops because they know they have to feed their kids in the coming season, right? It's why it's so hard to get farmers to grow anything but maize where we work, because they need to feed their kids. So I think we have to just find the right balance. And back to my social enterprise point, what we know from One Acre Fund is, farmers pay market price for fertilizer and seed. Like, you can help them partly through the right technology and just the right inputs. They can grow off that half an acre so they can actually feed their kids, and they can actually pay for those services, right? So it doesn't have to be fully donor funded, right? And that gives you a little bit of lee room to work on the higher value crops. But I do think there's often people often think that higher value crops are going to be a panacea for small farmers, and it's just not the case, right? They're part of a solution, but let's not forget what they need for the coming season, which is food to eat.
And let me add one more thing, and that's devolution. So when Uganda first decentralized, the districts had a lot of money. They had a good share of the national budget. They don't anymore. And that is a problem, because people need to hold their governments accountable for delivering what they deserve and need. And very few countries in Africa have decentralized funding down to the district, even to the district level, sub-district level. Thank you. So we want to, in the Movement for Community-Led Development, there are chapters in Uganda, there are chapters across Africa that are really pushing this idea that our local governance system should have at least a 20% share of the national budget. Kenya has it, Zambia's going there soon, and that's where you see government being responsive, because you can reach out and touch them, and particularly women, if they want to have voice in government, it better be within walking distance. So that move of decentralization, in 2014, the AU adopted a charter for decentralization, slowly moving forward. But I think it really is key to that transformation of governance. Okay, we're going to move to our next third of this event, and that is climate adaptation and centering the needs of small-scale food producers in policies. And this is a specialty of Mwandwe Chileshe. Did I say that pretty well?
Absolutely right.
Oh, good. So she is the global policy lead for food security, nutrition, and agriculture for Global Citizen. You've heard of Global Citizen. It's a big deal organization with a very big microphone. And so I owned the website for Global Citizen and gave it to Global Citizen. So I feel special ownership of Global Citizen. So I'd love for you to explain what you're doing, particularly with the Ban Ki-moon Center and IFAD, and the kind of policy impact you see having. So what do you see, particularly in climate change adaptation, is possible now?
Thank you so much. I think I've heard this legend about the person who owned the site. It's good to meet you in person. Thanks everybody for being here too. I think this conversation around, and it's really good to sort of piggyback off of the discussion that has just been had. And it's a question around, when we talk about smallholder farmers, we also have to think about money and capital, right? And so we've worked quite closely with IFAD, the Ban Ki-moon Center, even One Acre Fund, we work quite closely with a Global Citizen. But the idea is, how are we going to be able to unlock more resources for farmers? But there was also the question that was asked in terms of why aren't governments investing more? Government budgets have been constrained, especially in sort of lower to middle income countries. How do we get to that point where we unlock more resources for them? There was this sort of big ambition of, let's get to $100 billion for climate financing. When you look at the amount of money that's being raised there, we're not meeting that target. But even more so, the amount of financing from that's going to adaptation is much less than what goes to mitigation. You go a step further, the amount of that adaptation financing that's reaching small-scale farmers is next to nothing. So you start to look at sort of this idea of, if we're talking about small-scale farmers and smallholder food producers, how are we going to solve this idea of what they're going through if they don't have the access to capital and access to financing? I think it's a really big one. But I come from sort of an organization, Global Citizen, where we sit at this sort of mix between pop culture and policy, getting everyday people involved, calling on governments to take action. We have to ask ourselves the much simpler questions around, why is it also that we've been in a system where rural smallholder farmers continue to sort of be in this bucket? And you have to think about this idea of injustice as well, that we have not addressed this idea of inequity and injustice, and people don't experience things in monoliths. So they're not just experiencing this idea of they can't access agriculture inputs, is that they don't have access to healthcare, they don't have access to sort of financing, and being able to, first of all, just solve the problem of how they access their food allows them to feed themselves, but also it gets them a step further in being able to send their children to school, being able to access healthcare. And if we're able to get to this conversation around financing, addressing the injustice that has existed in the system, I think then we go a step further towards farmers. I'm going to end here because I do want to speak a little bit more around the consensus itself. But
please. So how do you tell us how the consensus was made, how you see it important, how you see using it, what can we all do with this thing to solve these problems?
Absolutely. I think, and it's good to have Asma and Liz in the room and other folks who contributed to this consensus. And it went through various iterations. One thing that was quite important was this idea of it's not a consensus for, we're not doing something for a community, it's with. How are we able to create a solution that exists where everybody co-owns it? I think it takes me back to this idea of injustice, but also a colonized way in how we think about ending extreme poverty or how we think about addressing these issues, that it's actually about saying, let's not just cast the light on this is where hunger sits, this is where starvation is showing itself, but can we talk about the solutions that exist in communities? And that's the sort of the birth of this consensus. So it's really about shifting this narrative of how we've previously done things, thinking about an overhaul of the system that has perpetuated extreme poverty, that sees that the people who are producing the very food that we consume, are they themselves experiencing hunger? I think that that's the core of the consensus. It's for civil society, it's for practitioners, it's for everybody in the space to be able to think about the ways in which we're going to unlock new financing and new ways of working so that we have a better way in which the people that produce food in our society can thrive.
So the first call to action point in the new consensus is about power and about bringing small-scale food producers to the policy table. Can you tell us a little bit about how that can be made to happen, how civil society, how farmers associations, et cetera, can really work to bring the voices of small-scale food producers to the policy table in their countries?
Exactly. I think it's this idea also of we should break down sort of this barrier of an us and them, a problem that exists elsewhere. I think we saw during COVID what it means when a problem exists in one place, what it means for you. And if we're able to think about this as we break down this power, something that we all experience, that whether I'm a smallholder farmer in rural Zambia in Kabwe, or I'm a smallholder farmer in the Philippines, how does that impact sort of the food system across the board? And it's this idea of if we break down sort of these power imbalances that have existed, that we can get to the root of being able to address some of the pieces that we need to. So when we speak about, I want to give this a bit of a story around Florence, a farmer I met about 2 months ago. And I was having a conversation with her around what are some of the biggest challenges that she faces. And it was difficult for her to be able to even pinpoint what is the biggest challenge that she faces. So I say to her, just walk me through your day. and says, well, my day will differ depending on the time of year. And that already will kind of get to the challenge. So she'll walk a very long distance to go and do a business that's around charcoal burning. And she says, I do the charcoal burning business in times when I can't get money out of the crops that I'm growing because I've been affected by drought. So it gets you thinking about, we won't be able to address this one problem around climate if we are not able to address how they grow their food or where they're getting their income. It's going to perpetuate sort of the bad practices around climate. I mean, think about adaptation. It's not a big idea. It's conservation farming. How can Florence on her small farm be able to withstand a drought? How can she be able to access extension services that makes her get more out of this? But also much more, if she wants to access capital and she doesn't own the land that she farms on, how do we address that problem?
And have you seen some examples of that, or are you campaigning in country for these things, or how is this going to how can we move this agenda forward, particularly in this issue of power and injustice?
I think this is where the consensus is really important, because it was, first of all, a foundation of, can we agree at least on what the major challenges are, and how do we start to address them? So this is why it's good to have this consensus. On the perspective of sort of global citizen, we've been working quite closely, like you mentioned, with the International Fund for Agriculture Development, who work quite directly with rural communities and smallholder farmers, but also work with governments. We work quite closely as well with like the Ban Ki-moon Center or One Acre Fund, thinking about what are the innovative ways in which we can sort of create new sources of financing. So in terms of the campaigning, I think that we've done quite a lot in also getting everyday people to think about farming in different ways. So if you live in an apartment here in Washington, D.C., how do you think about your own smallholder farming? So it's everything across the scale, and I think that this consensus gets us a few steps forward in changing that narrative of how we speak about food production and how we speak about smallholder food producers.
Good point. By the way, any of you who live in Washington, D.C. should know that the world leader in urban agriculture is the University of District of Columbia.
Really?
Yes. It is a first-rate agriculture department at the University of District of Columbia. Who knew? But it's they have a wonderful program there. You can visit. They have a farm just across the line in Maryland. It's a great asset. And in fact, they won the National Science Foundation Best Scientist Award or something. First time anybody in the DMV had done that. So yes, urban agriculture, go team. But it's really true, because you saw during COVID this recognition that, oh my gosh, we need a better local food system here, in the richest country on earth. That maybe opens a little window for some solidarity to address some of the systemic injustice in food systems. Because I know, like Food Tank, for instance, they work across both global and domestic as one issue. And I think I really appreciate your comment about ending this we they, because we are really all in this together. So tell me a little bit more about the other. So we talked about power, and I had the opportunity to ask the new president of EFAD, what's he doing about that power one? And he said, well, they're actually, since they've decentralized, they've gotten much better at getting farmers and policymakers into policy dialogues. So that's one step. But the other 7 calls to action around, you were speaking about finance, that's a big one. I know in the case of Ethiopia, there was a good producer safety net for a while, but I don't know if it's been replicated in other countries. So what kind of steps do you see people taking really to achieve those broad goals in the new consensus?
I have to take it back to what we are seeing now with sort of the food crisis. So we are at the point where we have 50 million people on the brink of starvation. We know that there's another 820 million people who all go to bed hungry. And it sort of begs the question of where has the system failed in many places. And we can already see that because we've focused the attention a lot on an immediate solve, that we haven't focused as much on resilience. And I think that what this crisis is doing is allowing us to think about beyond just delivering one meal to one person or one meal over a time of a crisis. How do we build the resilience of communities? And it goes back to this idea of power. Now people are talking a lot more about smallholder farmers. I think this is the most in the short time that I've worked in this space where I've heard people speak about smallholder food producers in the way that they are, because there's a recognition that if we don't invest in the resilience of communities, we are going to have another food crisis a short time from now. And I think that there's this point around people thinking about how we invest. And I go back to sort of IFAD, GASP, the sort of bigger institutions who are sort of addressing financing for rural smallholder farmers. And you see that there has been a lot of investment. IFAD just came out of its replenishment window. But even there, the kind of money that is going to their program like ASAP Plus, which is the program that looks at adaptation financing to small-scale farmers, hasn't met its 500 million target. And it sort of goes back to this idea of how do we unlock new resources to get into IFAD, GASP, the Africa Development Bank. It's thinking about sort of reallocating special drawing rights to those institutions. That conversation has come up, it just hasn't happened yet. And there is a way in which we can use this concept of a very simple idea of let's place small-scale farmers at the center of this discussion to then be able to influence this higher-level discussion of acronyms that we may or may not understand, SDRs, ASAP Plus, and all of this. But it's using this consensus to shift sort of a much larger discussion around sort of an overhaul of the system as it exists.
Wow. Okay. Well, then you're in the right building or right cluster of buildings, I guess, for this conversation. So, now this wasn't on my list of questions, but Global Citizen has been remarkably successful, as you said, working at the nexus of popular culture and addressing injustice. So, in this consensus, what do you see are the possibilities around that, around generating more awareness and more policy action?
I think that there is something for everybody to rally around in the consensus. And if you haven't read it, please make sure you do read it. And at Global Citizen, we've the conversations we have on a daily basis is we need to be able to speak to somebody who's coming to audience just because they know they want to go to a festival where Beyonce is going to be at or there's going to be an artist. So it needs to be something that resonates. And I think that the consensus does that. It's about how do we use sort of the tools, things that connect us all, things like music, to be able to actually influence policy. How do we bring people in the room? So a lot of the times when you walk into spaces like this, the majority of the people in this room came because they're already interested in this topic, right? So how do we, beyond this room, get more people to be interested in this conversation? And this is where this idea of pop culture comes in. But it's also where there's ideas like a consensus with smallholder farmers that is beyond just individual organizations, beyond the logos of Global Citizen, SDG2 Advocacy Hub, to the individual point of how can we advance this conversation. And I think that it's a good combination to bring the muscle of all of these sort of avenues and the individual power to be able to shift and break these barriers that I've talked about.
I particularly appreciate the comment you made on strengthening the resilience of communities, because one of the things that I wasn't aware of until like an IFPRI conference in Ethiopia in 2014, that resilience is only a community attribute. There's no such thing as a resilient nation or a resilient household. It's when there's a crisis, it's people in your community who need to rally. And a resilient nation is one that is filled with resilient communities. Similarly, as an individual, I can't really be resilient. I need my neighbors. I need people around me. So how do you see Global Citizen can really push that idea? Because I think people in general are not very clear on what to do to build the resilience of communities. What kind of messages do you see delivering on that?
I think that on this one, it's about institutionalizing the ideas that we've talked about. So if you look at I use this example of delivering one meal to one person, and I used this example earlier in the day again, where 50 million people on the brink of starvation does not equal 50 million meals, because if you give one meal on one day, they're not going to be resilient. And that's where this concept of resilience comes in. It's the idea that across the community, whether it's through an institution like IFAD that's working directly with governments, so that when they're no longer part of that project, that the governments can continue to lead on the project. It's the idea that you have access to capital beyond just agriculture inputs, that people are able to have capital that allows them to grow the scale of things that they are doing, whether you're a fisher folk, a pastoralist, or a smallholder farmer. This idea of resilience is that when there is a drought in my community, that there is enough, we have managed to store some other food stocks as well, that we will not have to rely on food stocks that are coming from Ukraine to be able to also withstand what's happening in our community. I think the idea of resilience can't equate to one word. It has to be a combination of these different factors.
Good point. I know my friends in Malawi, very drought-prone area, really were able to handle this storage thing, so that the next drought that hit Malawi, they actually were contributing grain to the World Food Program from this very low-income rural community. I mean, it's really possible to have that kind of community resilience. Okay, I'm turning back now. Who has comments for Mwandwe? Sorry, of course, Mwandwe. And this effort to really seize this moment now to push for utilizing this consensus for pushing for greater resilience for small food producers. Anybody? Thoughts, comments, questions, shared experiences? Asma, I'm calling on you.
Thanks, Mwandwe. I think you really summarized the intent behind the consensus really well. I guess a question for you, going back to the climate finance, we have COP27 coming up. What are your hopes and what needs to happen in November to really move the needle for smallholder farmers?
Thanks, Asma. It's an interesting question because we're at COP27 in November, and we continue to ask the very same questions, right? But it's encouraging to see that there's going to be a day on food security and nutrition at this COP. So already we are a few steps ahead in being able to think about smallholder farmers within that discussion. But I think that it's much more, we need to move the discussion beyond ambition and actually action, because I think that we saw a lot of that. I referenced this target on the $100 billion target for financing to mitigation, that if we can get to a point where countries actually outline 3-year plans of how they're going to make this happen, how this adaptation financing is going to reach small-scale farmers, that it's not just going to be stuck in institutions that don't reach the people that need this money. I think that's the type of action that needs to be seen. So it's moving from ambition to actual action, beyond the speeches, to a point where we see smallholder food producers being at the center of the discussion.
And will you be at COP27?
Maybe.
Well, apparently Biden will be at COP27. That's a step in the right direction.
No, but certainly I can say with Global Citizen, the intention, as together with the SDG 2 Advocacy Hub and other people that we're working with, is to be able to bring the same message to COP. The sort of voices that we've been working with and champions to also be able to have them speak about this issue. Yeah.
That's great. I know at the UN High-Level Political Forum this year, there was this launch of a new food systems transformation hub with the Rome-based agencies and UN Environment Program. So that was a step. There was, I don't think, ever that kind of marriage between UN Environment Program and the Rome-based food agencies before. So that's a step in the right direction pre-COP. And I know everybody has a lot of hopes for it. Anybody here going to COP27 want to say what they're looking to achieve there? Anyone here? Yeah, Colin.
Oh, I didn't want to say anything. I was just saying I'm going.
Oh, okay. Well, tell us what you're going to achieve there. You're representing all of us.
Maybe just to reiterate this point about, we're just vastly under investing in smallholder farmers. I'd mentioned earlier, as you look to transition farmers to this adaptation, resilience, to these practices, they just cost money at the end of the day. And smallholder farmers, they're not driving to work. They're not flying on airplanes to conferences. They have no responsibility for this crisis that we all collectively have created for them. And I think it's absolutely horrible, I think, that we're living in a world where they are going to be the most impacted from climate change. If you're relying on rain-fed agriculture, changes in rainfall and weather patterns literally will put you at the front lines of the impact of climate change. We're seeing this already. I mean, Malawi is at the front lines of the climate crisis. So I just think the message of COP27, which you've never had any focus on agriculture, let alone smallholders, I think the consensus needs to be a key part of it. And ultimately, we need to find some way, and I think Latte is going to figure it out, with all these cash-strapped governments actually allocating this $100 billion a year. So let's do it, right?
Yeah. Yes.
I have a question.
Could you come to a mic? We have people online, so we could get you a mic. That would be great.
Hi, my name is Monica, and I'm very interested.
A little closer.
Hi, my name is Monica, and I'm very interested in your efficiencies and your client delivery aspect that you were talking about on the inputs that farmers need. So I was just wondering, are you incentivizing the communities to be resilient to develop these inputs themselves, such as capturing seed? Where are these seeds coming from? Are using genetically modified seeds? Are they able to capture those seeds? Are they generating fertilizer, locally in order to also spur the economy? So it's really important to generate local sources of these inputs and not be reliant on external sources and sources far away.
Just very quickly, because I know we have more to talk about. I think the short answer is yes, but it's expensive. So I think as you look to transition to, there's actually interesting technology around locally produced fertilizer. Certainly organic fertilizer through composting is a tried and true method. Local seed production. Actually, all the seeds we buy is local, but not in the actual community. Yes, it all is important, but it costs money. And I think the more we want to focus regenerative agriculture practices, these are the kind of things that farmers are going to struggle to pay for on their own. So this is why we need the $100 billion commitment to be made.
Maybe I could just add a little bit to that. I think that it's an undertone that has come up a bit. I think Latte also talked about farmers who are able to sort of reuse the seed that they had. I think we are at the point now, especially with what we see with the food crisis, that we can't stop fertilizer as we use it now, because otherwise we punish people into starvation. But as we are making sure that we're figuring out the systems for that at the same time we need to be investing in more organic solutions. And this is the idea about resilience as we were talking about it. It's not looking at a solution as one thing, being able to find places where we invest that are able to grow the space in which we are. There's another thing that comes up a lot is seed sovereignty, and smallholder farmers, unfortunately, are disadvantaged by big agriculture, that they constantly have to then rely on bigger companies. And if we can have them have the dignity of being able to own the seed that they have and be able to reuse it, it gets us to that point of more sustainable agriculture.
I could not agree more. Thank you. Okay, time for the next section. And I'm going to introduce James Cotto, who is the co-chair of GAFSP, which is one of my favorite institutions. I've lobbied for it. I've campaigned for it. It has way too little money, but what money it has is, I think, using well. So I think Asma gave me some wonderful questions, but could you, for anybody who doesn't know what GAFSP is, could you explain what it is? It was, I know it was born out of the L'Aquila G7 Summit as a bold new initiatives for countries to actually pool their money for this issue. They pooled a little of it, not nearly enough, but tell us about what it is and how it works.
Yeah, thanks, John, and thanks very much to you and Asma for the invitation. So I'm here officially in my role of co-chair of GAFSP. So this year the United States is one of the co-chairs. Canada is the chair, and certainly we really appreciate their leadership. And it's been for me really interesting just hearing the comments by all of you and the discussion, because both about the importance of voice and agency in the discussion, but then particularly the resilience aspect which you brought up. And I think actually, from our perspective, I mean, that's part of the reason why GAFSP was born and why we think it's an important and valuable mechanism. So it's a very long acronym. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program. So yeah, it was created in 2010 following the last food security crisis. And it's a multilateral financing mechanism. So it's a fund, a financial intermediary fund that's administered here by the World Bank, though it works with implementing partners, development MDBs and other international organizations that have global coverage. So Mwandwe mentioned IFAD, based in Rome, that's one. Also FAO is another agency, but as well the regional development banks, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank. And what GAFSP is essentially is it's a financing mechanism. So it doesn't implement projects. What it does is it as John said, it aggregates financing from donors and partners. It does calls for proposals, and I think we're going to get an opportunity to talk about that. And in fact, that's something that we're very excited about elevating this week is GAFSP's latest call for proposals. And it really is focused on community-led and kind of country-led and producer-led development. And it's focused really on targeting smallholder farmers in the poorest and most vulnerable communities and countries. And so what it does is it's all grant financing. So it's providing grants to both countries and producer organizations. It also does loans on concessional terms and kind of blended finance products to the private sector and to agribusiness. So it has both a public sector track with sovereigns, and then it has a private sector track as well. And in fact, on the private sector side, we've as a steering committee, as kind of the group of GAFSP members, we've been working on expanding that and look to be sort of operationalizing changes on that early next year that's going to broaden the scope of the partners that it can work with. But to date, GAFSP is about a $2 billion financing mechanism. And I think getting to the point about agency and voice, what makes it so interesting, if I could say, or somewhat unique, is that it the kind of the governance structure that manages it. It includes both voting and non-voting members. So there's representatives from donors, but there's also representatives from the beneficiary countries and producer organizations, and then there's also civil society representatives that sit on the steering committee and are part of the governance structure. And so really the aim there is to bring kind of all the stakeholders together around the table, and for decisions to be made jointly, to be made by consensus, and kind of decide. There's a competitive allocation process for projects. Projects are reviewed in very rigorous and transparent ways with input from all, and so there's really an opportunity to get all the voices together when assessing what we're going to do with the resources. And I think what's really interesting too about GAFSB is that it very much does not duplicate efforts. It's very much complementary to the existing food security architecture because it's working with these implementing partners. But from our perspective as a donor, as the United States, one of the things that we think is so interesting and has been so useful in the experience of GAFSB since its founding now, 12-ish years ago, is that through this competitive allocation process, it's really promoting innovation, if you would, amongst the different implementing partners. And it's really allowing the best country developed, or locally developed projects to kind of rise up and get financing, and then the lessons learned from those can then be disseminated, if you would, and there's an opportunity for learning there that then we can put in feedback into projects and feedback into future calls for proposal. And then I'll stop here, but I would just say, I think our support for GAFSB and for smallholder farmers in particular in food security, from my perspective at the U.S. Treasury is 100% consistent with our broader resilience agenda, right, which includes climate, absolutely, and the administration has a very clear and coherent climate agenda that it's pursuing. We have food security, which has been a priority, long-standing priority for many years. As we can see, the U.S. was a founding donor of GAFSB in 2010. But also on health is the other aspect, and we mentioned that here today. And I wanted to just note that just in the recent weeks, we have successfully launched another financial intermediary fund that's going to be based here in the World Bank, focused on pandemic preparedness and response. And so, as we have our conversations internally, I just wholeheartedly agree with the points that have been here today, that we see all of these things as very much interlocking, and that when you have food security, particularly when you're focusing on the health and the resilience of local communities, really what you're having is beneficial impacts then that support our efforts to improve health, that support our efforts to include other social indicators, in education, strengthening education systems, and et cetera. So that, very much all interrelated.
The pandemic preparedness, that's a separate fund, or is it part of GAFSB?
No, separate. So that's entirely separate.
Okay.
Yeah, and focused on pandemic preparedness and response. But certainly we as a donor, our job is to make sure that all of these things are knitting together in a coherent policy way.
And this seventh call for proposals of GAFSB, when is that happening?
So actually it has now launched. The soft launch was at the end of September. So it is now open. We're in what is now the expressions of interest phase. And I'm going to use this event to plug another event, if you permit me. But tomorrow we're having a kind of an informational or sort of launch event for the call for proposals here. Actually, I think it's in the main building at 9 a.m. So anybody who is interested in learning more about the call for proposals, you're more than welcome. But as I said, this is the seventh call. It'll run through the end of December. Again, it's a transparent and open allocation process. We're looking to have kind of an initial allocation of around $200 million, again, in grant financing. Absolutely expect that is not going to be enough to satisfy what I'm sure is going to be a very robust pipeline of really good proposals, but we're really interested in continuing to keep the call open and encouraging other donors to join us. The United States has contributed $155 million to GAFSB this year, and so in fact, we very much, I think the call for proposals is very much facilitated by that contribution. Those other donors have joined as well, including Germany, Norway, Spain. The Gates Foundation also has been a long-standing partner. And of course, the U.S. contribution is part of the broader response to the food security crisis that we've delivered this year. As we've all seen, we've talked about the higher prices, that higher inflation, the different shocks, energy shock, input shocks. Certainly all exacerbated by Russia's war on Ukraine, and so following the outbreak of the war, the U.S. has now announced nearly $10 billion in support this year. Most of it is for humanitarian aid, and I think we can all agree there's really tremendous acute needs. But a lot of it is, a good portion of it is focused on, and what we at the U.S. Treasury are very focused on, is keeping the eye on the need for promoting sustainable investment in long-term resilience in food systems, climate resilient systems, productive and efficient systems. And so we think this call for proposals is a way to continue to elevate and encourage additional donor assistance, and hopefully we can get more resources to go to smallholder
Good.
communities.
Very good. Okay, I now want to turn to Madhur Gautam, who is the lead economist, World Bank Food and Agriculture. And particularly, we wanted to hear about this new Global Alliance for Food Security that was recently launched by Germany and the World Bank, I guess. And could you say a little bit about how you see that platform could support small food producers?
Thank you. And thanks for the invitation to be on this panel. A really interesting discussion earlier. I'd like to follow up with many of the panelists afterwards. The Global Alliance for Food Security was announced by the G7 presidency, and Germany was held the presidency, and the World Bank. And it was to sort of the first objective was to try to bring attention to the crisis that we have now. I think a lot of people recognize that we have a serious problem, but the numbers we are seeing have never been, at least since the numbers have been recorded, have never been so high. And no matter which metric you take, and then one of the problems is that different institutions use. Not a problem. I'm just saying that different institutions use different numbers. So one of the objectives was to try and bring together as much information as we want. For example, the excellent work that the institutions that are members of the Global Network for Food Crises do an excellent job of monitoring what's happening, but they are only in 53 countries. Right? The field presence is limited. Those are some of the worst affected countries. Of course, they need tremendous amount of help. That was already laid out earlier by Latte in Somalia, Yemen, and the East, in the Horn of Africa. But there are also a number of others. And what we forget is that if you look at the FAO severe food crises, people in severe food insecurity, is nearly a billion people. And majority of those, are the fastest growing numbers are in middle income countries and others that are not your traditional countries that have been affected and are suffering. So there's a tremendous amount of information that we need. So one of the first things that the Alliance is doing is to sort of bring together some of this information. The World Bank serves as a secretariat, and I should, in full disclosure, show that I'm not responsible for that. I'm not dealing with that. A colleague of mine is, but I'll give you the information as best as I can. So we are putting together the information and creating a dashboard that collects just in time and as comprehensive information as possible, so that different players and different stakeholders there's some transparency in the information, and everybody knows what is happening. Everybody sees the gaps and the opportunities and the needs of different countries, and action can be taken accordingly. So that's one of the first things to do. So the core aims of that is to sort of provide advice, the 3 A's: advice, action, and advance, is to sort of support coordinated just-in-time information exchange, track information on financing food security responses, and to bring together research and leading research thinking on how to deal with the underlying causes and root causes of food insecurity. Now, there's a whole agenda behind that. GAFS is intended to be, or at least when it was announced, it was intended to be a short-term, like an 18 months to 24 months initiative to sort of really bring focus on these issues. But the underlying factors are something that we are all working on in our Food System 2030 approach at the World Bank, and I'm sure all the UN Rome-based agencies. All of our main agendas are to address the core issue of medium and long-term food insecurity. Of course, humanitarian response and short-term responses are essential. But unless we tackle the medium to long-term issues and drivers, we are not getting out of it. We'll see this again and again, as we have seen it in the last 20 years.
Yep. So one of the things I think a lot of us have heard about for a long time are agricultural subsidies. Mm-hmm. And I'm told that you have been working specifically on how to repurpose that huge amount of money that is involved with agricultural subsidies, working with IFPRI and others. So can you tell us a little about that and what that could mean for transforming food systems?
Thank you. That's a topic that is occupying me pretty much full time right now. You're right. I worked in agricultural policy and rural development policy for a very long time. And one of the core issues that we've seen is, and we have come at it from a very sort of a technical point of view, that it's inefficient, it's a waste of money. Yes, that's all true. And that doesn't really actually fly very well with the policymakers. It's a huge political economy problem. So keep that in mind. That said, we were talking about climate finance and trying to generate finance. You're talking about $100 billion, right? Guess what? The agricultural subsidies, agricultural support, let me be very clear. Agriculture support is about $640 billion. And this is by just 79 countries where we have data. You can imagine how much majority of this is in developed countries. But keep that in mind that it is not for shortage of money that the system is broken. And I'm sure you have heard of the fact that the food system is broken, how much the hidden costs are in terms of health costs, environmental costs, and so on. So those costs right now, and if you add them up and follow the Food and Land Use Coalition, actually did that a couple of years ago. Once you add that up, that's about $12 billion. At that time, the global agricultural GDP was $10 trillion, I'm sorry. So $12 trillion and $10 trillion. So we basically actually raises the question of, no, it's not technically correct, but makes you think that are we actually subtracting value from the food system? So hence the issue of need for transforming the food system. Now, if you're going to transform the food system, it's not going to happen, at the margin. You can do a lot of things, and we have done that for a long time. The core issue is incentives. Are we providing the policies and support in a manner that promotes the right kinds of outcomes that we want, which is healthier, nutritious diets, sustainable agricultural production, resilience, and dealing with helping the small farmers. The second issue on the linking it more directly to small farmers, first, all of our work is pretty much directed at small farmers. So the question here is, are these subsidies actually reaching the small farmer, or are these subsidies and support actually reaching the small farmer or not? About 540, let me say, is what OECD calls the most distortive subsidies, $540 billion. Half of that is a little more than half of that is distortive prices, which means the food prices are being kept high. Now, do they actually make it to the small farmers? Who's actually benefiting from those? So that incidence analysis is extremely important. But more importantly, that those high food prices are hurting the consumers. And a lot of smallholders are net food buyers. So the question is, who is that really helping by keeping the prices high through whether it is border controls or other mechanisms? The rest is through input-output subsidies. And we are not saying remove the subsidies. What we want to say is, given the political economy and given the fact that farmers do need support, what we are saying is, can we deliver this in a manner that is much more, one, transparent, two, well targeted, and three, in a manner that supports the outcomes that we want. So, for example, can we support climate smart technologies? Can we suppose the regenerative technologies? And how can we, are we investing enough in innovation that actually leads to these technologies that Colin was talking about? Do we have enough of those? Yes, we have some, but we need a lot more than we have done. Historically, we have invested in all of our agriculture research in the last 50 years, has not all, but let me say the majority of it, and even now, goes to production of calories. And yes, that was needed. I'm not saying that was wrong. It was needed back in the 60s when there was starvation, widespread prospects of starvation. But that has changed now. People want healthier foods. People want more sustainable agriculture systems. At that time, we weren't aware of that. We need better and a lot more innovation in fertilizers that are much more organic. Right now, as Mandwe, not Mwande, Mandwe, was saying, it'll punish the smallholders by if we were to sort of all of a sudden cut away all fertilizer use. I mean, we have a live example of Sri Lanka. So we don't want to do that. So question here is, can we invest and can we invest a lot more in biological nitrogen fixation, for example, that does away with the use of urea and chemical fertilizers? But that will take time. And I think we need to do a lot more in terms of shifting our, not just more research, but research in a way that promotes what we call green innovation. This is the IFPRI study. And that shows, actually, in the study we found that for every dollar that we spend, the benefit that we really get out of it is 35 cents. So the transfer efficiency is 35%. See, these subsidies and support is not being used in the right way.
Right.
It's not even delivering the objective we want to deliver. So, but it is a political problem. We understand that farmers need support. And in the past that we have done this has not been the best approach. Is coming at it from a very economist point of view. So I think we need to do it smarter. So this is the whole repurposing agenda that I'm currently engaged in, and well, I'm from my side, but the World Bank is, and a lot of others. I think FAO is also very heavily involved in this now, and it's talking about climate. And then just one more thing. Yes, what you can do at Climate COP27 is to make sure that agriculture is finally, for sure, in the climate discussions. Agriculture has been out of climate discussions for the longest time. Last year, in our partnership with the UK presidency, we were trying to do these policy dialogues among different countries and stakeholders. We were able to, and the UK succeeded in sort of taking this whole repurposing agenda and the whole subsidy agenda and agriculture agenda to COP26 at a plenary level. Why? Because agriculture is the most vulnerable, so it's a whole resilience issue to climate change. But it also contributes 1/3. The food system contributes about 34%, 33% of the greenhouse gas emissions. It's also cause of the problem.
Yeah.
So we need to deal with this. It has to be in the climate discussions.
I agree. Okay, we have a few minutes more for any comments, questions. Yes. Can you dash up to a microphone? I love energetically waved hand.
Yes, thank you. I'm so interested. Thank you. And my question goes on how you, and that's actually to you, but also the others, how do you cooperate with private sector in that respect? I mean, big agriculture companies are part of the problem, but they should also be part of the solution, I suppose. So how do you, what's your take on that? Thanks.
Who wants to take on Big Ag?
Our private sector, the World Bank Group's private sector IFC has a large program, and they've just announced a global food security platform, and where they are doing exactly these kinds of things is working with private sector to to sort of start a lot more investment in green fertilizers and moving towards more sustainable technologies and practices. I mean, this is to go to the root causes of food security that I was referring to. In other cases, I think what we want to do is we want to partner with the private sector. It is here to stay. So the question here is, can we work with them first to level the playing field on the policy side? Because a lot of what the private sector gains from, perhaps, I won't say it assertively, but is that the playing field is stacked against the smallholder. So can we actually level that so that at least they have a level playing field to play on, and then see how to target subsidies which are often very regressive, and the policies are often regressive, which don't necessarily reach the smallholder as much as they should, which is the intended target actually of most policymakers. I think these policies are well intended, but we also have a lot of lessons on how to change that. So work with the private sector to, a lot of innovation is needed. I don't think there's enough public resources. There's trillions of dollars in private sector investment. The question is, can we leverage through policy and through other actions to leverage that money to move the needles on food system transformation the way we want it?
Good. I know Oxfam has done a lot of work in this field.
Yeah, that's a good question. We definitely see the private sector as really part of the problem, but also part of the solution. So double edge. But in Oxfam, we work a lot. We have a full department working on the private sector and foods. But we come to it from, again, small-scale farmers, but also climate change. We ran a campaign about 6-7 years ago. We call it Behind the Brands, where we rank the top 10, actually, private sector companies in the food. They control more than 80% of the global food system. And then working with them to pressure them to make big commitment. You have companies like Coca-Cola, they made commitment on land issues, for instance, zero land grab. Deforestation is a big one. What we are seeing in the Amazonia, in countries like Peru, Brazil. So many of them are now making big commitments, climate change and the whole net zero, but more and more so on living income for farmers, right? For farmers who work in the supply chain, like you take cocoa from West Africa, how do you make sure that those farmers can really earn a decent living income? Gender issues as well, right? Land right for women voice and agency in the supply chain, so things like that. So yeah, we see the private sector as key in solving these kind of issues. Yeah, thank you.
Oh yes, James.
Yeah, no, just very quickly, just because I think it's a really interesting point and a really interesting question, and just in the context of GAFSP, but I think also in EFAD as well. I mean, the private sector is very much a partner. I would say in the context of GAFSP, because because of the structure, the governance structure that it's in place with producer organizations there, and community stakeholders and civil society, you do see a focus very much on local, community created and stakeholder driven, smallholder farmer driven private sector firms. One example that I would just use to illustrate is in Bhutan, that GAFSP partnered with both IFC and the Asian Development Bank to do an equity investment, like a $12 million equity investment in a hazelnut firm that was created by kind of an association of smallholder farmers. And basically, like this firm was helping them both with training, but also providing inputs, plant seedlings and things like that, and helping them expand the production. But then that was also the firm was then the vehicle that was helping them improve access to external markets. So, yeah. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So we are at the end of time. I think they'll probably turn off our live feed, but people are going to be hanging around for a while. I want to first thank our amazing panelists. It was just such a privilege getting to sit in the middle of you all, and organizations that I've admired so long. And always permanently grateful that I handed over the internet domain to Global Citizen, and I particularly want to thank my colleague Anna, who helped organize this, and Asma Latif, one of the people I admire most in the Washington D.C. area and in the world, and all of you for all the roles, different roles that you are playing in this quest for human dignity and resilience. So thank you all, and we're at time.